The 17th of January 1940. Detroit, Michigan. The assembly line at the River Rouge plant hums with the rhythmic percussion of industrial America. Sparks cascade from welding torches like fireflies in the winter gloom. The air tastes of hot metal and machine oil. Here, in the sprawling cathedral of Henry Ford's empire, men in canvas work jackets, bolt chrome trim, to the latest sedan model, sleek, civilian, peaceful. Outside, snow falls soft on automotive showrooms, where families will soon browse gleaming Fords and Chevrolets, symbols of prosperity recovered from the Depression's shadow. The war in Europe seems an ocean away, a distant thunder that does not yet shake American soil. But in the corridors of the War Department in Washington, men in pressed uniforms stare at maps with growing unease. Poland has fallen in 27 days. France will hold, they tell themselves. Britain will endure. And if America must enter this conflict, if the unthinkable becomes inevitable, surely the nation that built 15 million automobiles in a decade can build tanks. They do not yet know the truth. America has no mass tank production. Not in any meaningful sense. Not in any way that could face the mechanized legions now rolling across Europe. The United States Army in 1940 possesses fewer than 400 tanks, most of them obsolete relics from the last war. Their riveted hulls and anemic engines a generation behind the German panzers carving through French defences. American arsenals produce tanks at the rate of a few dozen per year, handcrafted in government facilities, with methods more befitting a watchmaker's shop than an industrial power. While Hitler's Reich churns out armoured divisions by the score, America's peacetime military crawls forward on the technology of 1918, sustained by isolationist sentiment and a Congress that sees no profit in preparing for foreign wars. The German General Staff knows this. Their intelligence estimates of American industrial capacity are thorough, clinical. They note the vast automobile industry, yes, but they understand that building a Buick and building a Panzer are not the same endeavour. A tank is not simply a car with armour plate. It requires precision gears that can withstand battlefield stress, suspension systems that function in desert heat and Russian winter, engines that produce battlefield reliability rather than showroom appeal. The Germans, who have spent years perfecting their war machine, believe the Americans are at least 3 years behind optimistically. 5 years is more realistic. By then, they calculate, the war will be decided. In Tokyo, Japanese military planners reach similar conclusions. They see America as a nation of consumers, not warriors. A people grown soft on refrigerators and radio programs, whose young men know more about baseball scores than battlefield tactics. The Americans have resources, certainly steel, rubber, the industrial heartbeat of a continent, but resources mean nothing without the will to transform them, without the knowledge of how to turn automobile factories into arsenals. The Japanese High Command notes that America has never mobilized its full industrial capacity for total war. They doubt it can be done, and they doubt it can be done in time. What neither the Germans nor the Japanese understand, what perhaps no one fully understands in January 1940, is that Detroit's automotive empire has spent 2 decades perfecting something more dangerous than any weapon: the science of mass production itself. Henry Ford's assembly line was never about cars. It was about the systematic demolition of complexity, the reduction of manufacturing to its simplest, most repeatable elements. It was about discovering that any product, no matter how intricate, could be broken down into sequential operations performed by semi-skilled workers using specialized tools. It was about speed, volume, and the ruthless efficiency of American capitalism operating at maximum velocity. The automobile industry had not merely learned to build things quickly, it had learned to redesign products specifically to be built quickly, to engineer manufacturability into every component, every process, every second of production time. But in January 1940, that potential remains theoretical. The machines still stamp out fenders and doors, the workers still build cars. And in Washington, the planners still hope that diplomacy will hold, that America can remain the arsenal of democracy without becoming its battleground. Then May comes, and with it, catastrophe. The fall of France shatters all assumptions. German panzers accomplish in 6 weeks what 4 years of trench warfare could not achieve in the previous war. The French army, considered the finest in Europe, collapses. The British escape at Dunkirk, but leave behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, the material foundation of an army. Newsreels show German armour rolling through Paris, past the Arc de Triomphe, down boulevards designed for victory parades but now hosting conquest. The speed of it, the mechanical precision of the German advance, makes it clear that this war will not be won by riflemen in trenches, but by steel and horsepower, by the nation that can produce more machines faster. President Roosevelt understands what the maps now scream. Britain stands alone, and if Britain falls, the Atlantic becomes a German lake. He calls for 50,000 aircraft, a number so staggering that even his own military chiefs think it fantasy. But aircraft need tanks to support them, armies to follow them, a complete mechanized force that simply does not exist. The arsenal of democracy must be built from the ground up, and it must be built immediately, and the only institutions in America with the capacity to do this are the automobile companies of Detroit. The call goes out. Chrysler, General Motors, Ford corporations that have competed ruthlessly in the marketplace must now collaborate in ways they never imagined. William Knudsen, president of General Motors, is summoned to Washington and given a mandate that would seem impossible if it were not desperately necessary. Transform American automobile production into the greatest military-industrial complex the world has ever seen. Do it in months, not years. Do it while still producing civilian vehicles, because the economy cannot yet sustain full conversion. Do it without blueprints for most of the weapons needed, without trained workers for specialized military production, without any of the infrastructure that takes nations decades to develop. The automobile executives arrive in Washington expecting to build trucks, perhaps light reconnaissance vehicles. They are handed specifications for medium tanks, the M3, soon to be followed by the M4 Sherman. 30 tons of armor plate, a 75mm gun, a radial aircraft engine, transmission systems that must operate flawlessly under combat conditions. The engineering challenges are immense. Steel must be welded and cast to tolerances that automobile production never required. The armor itself must be heat-treated, a process that automotive plants do not possess. Turret rings must rotate smoothly under tons of weight. Tracks must be forged from manganese steel, a material that automotive factories have never worked with in meaningful quantities. But what the military planners do not fully appreciate, what will only become clear in the months ahead, is that Detroit's genius lies not in building complex machines, but in reconceiving them to be mass-produced. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, engineers stare at the Army's specifications with the cold eye of production men. The original tank designs are artisanal nightmares, each one requiring hundreds of hours of skilled labor, hand-fitted parts, machining operations that cannot be replicated at speed. The automotive engineers begin to tear them apart conceptually, asking the question that will define American war production. How do we build 10,000 of these instead of 10? The answer requires reinventing the tank itself. Armor plate that was riveted will now be welded, faster and stronger. Complex castings will be simplified, designed for high-volume production rather than custom fabrication. Components will be standardized across multiple tank models so that parts can be interchangeable, so that entire subassemblies can be manufactured at different facilities and brought together on final assembly lines. The tank must be redesigned around the assembly line's requirements, not the other way around. This is heresy to military tradition. European tanks are built by specialists, craftsmen who understand armor warfare. The Germans have excellent tanks because they have been building them for years, iterating designs, training workers in the specific skills required. The Americans are proposing to build tanks the way they build Chevrolets, fast, standardized, with workers who learned their jobs last week. The military establishment resists. These are weapons of war, not consumer goods. Complexity cannot be eliminated without compromising capability. But time is the enemy now, and time sides with Detroit. By late 1940, groundbreaking begins on the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, a dedicated facility designed from scratch for one purpose: mass-producing tanks at automotive speeds. The building rises across 113 acres, a cathedral of steel and concrete. Inside, assembly lines stretch for nearly a mile. Overhead cranes capable of lifting complete tank hulls move on rails. Welding stations are positioned for maximum efficiency. The plant is designed so that raw steel enters at one end and finished tanks roll out the other, just like cars, except these cars weigh 30 tons and carry cannons. The workers who will build these machines are not soldiers. They are automotive workers, many of them pulled from unemployment lines, trained in weeks rather than years. They are women, taking jobs in heavy industry for the first time because the men are being drafted. They are African Americans migrating from the South, finding opportunity in war production that peacetime America denied them. They are the civilians of American democracy, and they are about to do what the Axis powers believe impossible. The first M3 tank rolls off the line in April 1941. It is not beautiful. It is tall and awkward, its 75mm gun mounted in a sponson on the right side of the hull because the Americans have not yet perfected turret designs for such large weapons. British tankers will nickname it the Grant and complain about its height, its riveted construction, its tendency to catch fire. It is, in every measurable way, inferior to the latest German designs. But it exists, and behind it, the assembly line is already producing the next one, and the next, and the next. By the end of 1941, the Chrysler Arsenal alone is producing tanks faster than the entire American military-industrial complex had managed in the previous decade. General Motors converts its Cadillac factories. Ford builds the massive Willow Run plant, which will eventually produce B-24 bombers at the rate of 1 per hour. Across Detroit and beyond Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles automotive plants reconfigure their production lines. The machines that stamped out car doors now stamp out armor plate. The workers who assembled transmissions now assemble tank drivetrains. The supply chains that delivered rubber and steel for civilian vehicles now feed the machinery of war. The scale becomes astronomical. By 1943, American industry is producing tanks at rates that defy comprehension more in a month than many nations produced in the entire war. The M4 Sherman, successor to the M3, becomes the defining symbol of American armored warfare. It is not the best tank in the world. German Tigers and Panthers outgun it, out-armor it, can destroy it at ranges where the Sherman cannot effectively fight back. But for every Tiger, there are 10 Shermans. For every Panther, 15. The Americans have solved a different equation, not how to build the perfect tank, but how to build adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers, how to sustain production at levels that simply bury the enemy in materiel. German tankers on the Eastern Front begin to understand what they face. The accounts filter back through intelligence channels, through letters home, through the quiet conversations of men who have seen the future and find it terrifying. They speak of American tanks appearing in numbers that make no tactical sense, of losing battles not because of superior enemy skill but because the Americans can afford to trade 3 tanks for 1 and still have reserves. They describe supply depots stretching to the horizon, tank parks where hundreds of Shermans await deployment, a mechanical tide that never seems to diminish no matter how many are destroyed. A German tank commander, captured after the Normandy invasion, sits in an interrogation room and tries to explain what he witnessed. "We destroyed 11 of their tanks in one afternoon," he says, his voice flat with exhaustion. "We were jubilant. We thought we had won the engagement. Then, the next morning, 15 more appeared. Where do they come from? How can you fight an enemy who builds faster than you can destroy?" This is the question that begins to haunt the Axis war planners. Intelligence reports flow into Berlin and Tokyo, and what they reveal is not merely industrial production, It is industrial transformation on a scale never before witnessed. The Americans have not simply built more factories, they have fundamentally altered the nature of manufacturing itself. They have taken mass production, already refined through decades of automotive competition, and weaponized it. The Japanese, who counted on American isolationism and unpreparedness, watch with growing alarm as the numbers accumulate. In 1941, Japan possessed naval superiority in the Pacific. By 1943, American shipyards are launching aircraft carriers faster than Japan can train pilots. Essex-class carriers, each one capable of projecting overwhelming air power, slide down shipways built by men who were constructing merchant vessels 2 years earlier. The Kaiser shipyards on the west coast perfect techniques of welding and prefabrication that allow them to build Liberty ships' 10,000-ton cargo vessels in an average of 42 days. One vessel, the Robert E. Peary, is completed in 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of what American industry can achieve when fully mobilized. But the tanks remain the most visible symbol, the steel embodiment of American productive capacity. Shermans land at Normandy by the hundreds, pour through the bocage country of France, drive across Germany itself. They serve in North Africa, where their reliability in desert conditions proves superior to more sophisticated German designs that break down in the sand and heat. They equip Free French forces, British armoured divisions, Soviet tank brigades through Lend-Lease. The Sherman becomes ubiquitous, the universal tank of the Allied powers, precisely because Detroit has learned to build them faster than the world can consume them. The symbolism is not lost on those who face them. To German soldiers retreating across France in 1944, the Sherman represents something more terrifying than its 75mm gun or its armor plate. It represents American abundance, the casual wealth of a nation that can afford to ship 30-ton machines across an ocean as if they were consumer goods, that can lose them by the dozens and simply produce more. German tanks, by contrast, are increasingly rare, precious resources to be husbanded and protected because the Reich's factories are being bombed into rubble, because fuel is scarce, because the raw materials for armor plate are running out. In the Ardennes forest in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German armoured divisions make their last great offensive in the West. They achieve surprise, drive deep into American lines, capture fuel depots and supply centres. For a few days, it seems possible that panzer divisions might reach the Meuse River, might split the Allied armies, might change the war's trajectory. But the offensive stalls not primarily because of heroic resistance, though there is plenty of that, but because the Germans run out of fuel while the Americans do not. Because German tanks break down and cannot be repaired while American Shermans receive spare parts flown in by the crate. Because the arithmetic of production has created a situation where the Wehrmacht is fighting with finite resources against an enemy with effectively infinite supply. A young panzer grenadier, part of the Ardennes offensive, writes in his diary during the retreat, "We passed a field where the Americans had abandoned 20 tanks, just left them, as if they were not worth recovering. 20 tanks. Our entire division has fewer than that operational. I understand now that we cannot win. You cannot defeat an enemy who discards more than you possess." This is the psychological impact that Detroit's transformation achieves, not merely material superiority, but the crushing realization that the enemy's reserves are bottomless, that every battle is unwinnable, not because of tactics or courage, but because the Americans have solved the industrial equation in a way that makes conventional warfare obsolete. The numbers tell a story that generals and historians will parse for generations. From 1,940 to 1,945, American factories produce approximately 88,000 tanks, more than Germany and Japan combined. But raw numbers obscure the deeper transformation. Detroit does not merely build tanks, it industrializes warfare itself, applies the principles of mass production to every aspect of military supply. Jeeps roll off assembly lines at the rate of 1 every 90 seconds. Aircraft engines are produced in quantities that allow the Army Air Forces to treat them as disposable, replacing them at scheduled intervals rather than maintaining them to failure. Ammunition production reaches levels where artillery crews are encouraged to fire liberally, to saturate targets with shells because scarcity is no longer a consideration. The automotive industry's contribution extends beyond the vehicles themselves. Ford engineers develop portable bridges that can be assembled in hours, allowing armor to cross rivers without waiting for permanent infrastructure. Chrysler perfects the design of anti-aircraft guns that can be mass-produced with interchangeable parts, transforming air defense from an art to a science of volume. General Motors' experience with precision machining allows rapid production of artillery pieces that would have taken months to produce using traditional methods. And through it all, the symbolism of Detroit, of American industrial, might become a weapon in itself. Propaganda films show endless assembly lines, rivers of tanks flowing from factories, the mechanical proof of democratic superiority. To Allied populations, these images are reassurance. We will win because we can outproduce the enemy. To Axis populations, they are demoralizing, visual evidence that the war is unwinnable, that German and Japanese industry cannot match the scale of American commitment. But the transformation has not come without cost. The workers on the assembly lines experience the war in 12-hour shifts, in the thunder of stamping presses, in the flash of welding torches that leave spots in their vision. Women who took these jobs for patriotism and paychecks face workplace dangers that automotive production never required, handling armor plate weighing tons, working with materials and processes where mistakes can be fatal. African American workers who migrated north find opportunity mixed with discrimination, gaining access to jobs previously denied while still facing segregated facilities and limited advancement. Detroit itself transforms. The city swells with war workers, housing shortages become critical, racial tensions erupt in riots in 1943 as competition for jobs and housing strains social fabric. The automotive companies make staggering profits, even as they claim patriotic purpose, and labor unions fight for better wages while being accused of undermining the war effort. The production miracle has a human cost measured in exhaustion, injury, social disruption, the price of telescoping decades of industrial development into 5 years of total war. Yet the workers understand, in ways that perhaps the generals and politicians do not fully appreciate, what they have accomplished. They have taken America from industrial power to industrial superpower, from a nation capable of mass production to a nation capable of dictating terms through material supremacy. The men and women on the assembly lines have become soldiers in a different kind of warfare, one fought with blueprints and production schedules rather than rifles, but no less critical to victory. By 1945, when the war ends, the transformation is complete. Germany's industrial cities lie in ruins, their factories shattered by strategic bombing. Japan's manufacturing capacity has been incinerated by incendiary raids and strangled by submarine blockade. Britain and the Soviet Union, though victorious, are exhausted and bankrupted, their economies surviving only through American aid. France is rebuilding from occupation. China is engulfed in civil war. And Detroit's factories, barely scratched by the conflict, are poised to convert back to civilian production, to unleash the same productive fury that created the arsenal of democracy onto peacetime markets. The techniques perfected during the war, the logistics systems, the production management, the economies of scale will drive the greatest economic expansion in American history, creating a middle-class prosperity that becomes the envy of the world and the living embodiment of capitalism's promise. But the tanks remain the enduring symbol. In Moscow, captured German equipment is displayed alongside American Lend-Lease Shermans, evidence of the alliance that defeated fascism. In Washington, military planners study the production statistics and realize that industrial capacity is now the foundation of national power, that future wars will be won or lost in factories before armies ever meet on battlefields. In Detroit, the workers return to building cars, but they carry with them the knowledge that they reshaped history, that their labor at the assembly lines was as crucial as any infantry assault, any bomber raid, Any naval engagement. Decades later, historians will debate the turning points of World War II. Stalingrad, where German expansion broke against Soviet resistance. Midway, where American naval power shattered Japanese offensive capability. Normandy, where the liberation of Europe began on blood-soaked beaches. But perhaps the true turning point came in January 1940, in Detroit, when men looked at automotive assembly lines and understood, however dimly at first, that the same industrial science that built 15 million cars could build 15,000 tanks, that mass production could be transformed from an economic advantage into a strategic weapon, that America's greatest strength was not its military tradition or its tactical brilliance, but its ability to manufacture victory itself. The German and Japanese war planners had been right about one thing. In January 1940, America had no mass tank production. What they failed to understand was that America had something more dangerous, the knowledge of how to create it, the industrial infrastructure to support it, and the civic will to mobilize it. They saw the absence of tanks and concluded weakness. They should have seen the assembly lines and concluded doom. In the end, Detroit did not merely build the arsenal of democracy. Detroit proved that democracy could mobilize industrial capitalism for total war and win, not through superior tactics or ideology, but through the grinding, relentless application of productive capacity. The tanks were never the most advanced, never the most elegant, but they were sufficient, and they were numberless, and they arrived when needed in quantities that made victory inevitable. The lesson was not lost on the post-war world. The Cold War would become, in many ways, a competition of industrial production, each side striving to demonstrate that its economic system could outproduce the other. The American model, mass production, consumer abundance, technological innovation driven by profit motive, would become the template that defeated Soviet communism, not on battlefields but in factories and showrooms, through the same overwhelming material superiority that buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of Shermans. But in January 1940, when the assembly lines hummed with the production of civilian sedans, when snow fell soft on Detroit and the war seemed an ocean away, none of this was inevitable. It required vision to see that automobiles and tanks were variations on the same industrial theme. It required courage to gamble that civilian factories could be transformed before the enemy arrived at the gates. It required the labor of millions who worked shifts that exhausted body and spirit because they understood that every tank mattered, that production was patriotism, that the fate of civilization might rest on whether they could weld one more seam, install one more engine, send one more machine toward the sound of guns. They did, and in doing so, they wrote a chapter in human history about what is possible when industrial capacity meets existential necessity, when the machinery of peace becomes the machinery of war, when a nation's greatest weapon proves to be not its generals or its soldiers, but its factories, its engineers, its workers, and its unshakable belief that any problem can be solved through sufficient application of American ingenuity and mass production. The tanks that rolled off Detroit's assembly lines were more than weapons. They were proof of concept, steel testimony to the idea that democracy's disorder could outproduce dictatorship's efficiency, that freedom's apparent chaos concealed an industrial power that totalitarianism could never match. Every Sherman that landed on a European beach, every M3 that fought in North Africa, every tank that was built and shipped and deployed and sometimes destroyed, and then replaced without pause. Each one was a mechanical envoy, carrying a message that the Axis powers finally understood too late. America had learned to manufacture victory itself, and no army on earth could stand against that.